Hello everyone, and thanks for coming. My name is Angela Harutyunyan, and I'm a professor in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History. Here at AUB I teach modern and contemporary art history and theory. And today I'll deliver one of the Enrichment lectures for your CBSP course. It's titled The Limits of Representation, Enlightenment and Art. What the title already implies is that there is no such thing as enlightenment as a style in art. But yet what I will argue today is that the contradictions of the Enlightenment appear both in aesthetic debates, in aesthetic philosophy that was being developed at the time, as well as in artistic practices. So I want to start today with a film by Werner Herzog, a German film director. The film is from 1974. It's called The Enigma of Caspar Hauser. So the opening scene, in the opening scene we see our main hero, Caspar Hauser, in a barn. He's a teenage boy, but he appears in an animalistic state, in chains, and with a minimum of human contact with only a person who feeds him. Enigmatically and without explanation, his master, this person who feeds him, sends him away with a letter addressed to the burghers of the town, to the citizens, right? Literally the bourgeoisie, the people of the town, who are asked to receive Caspar. As our hero first regains his human composure and ability to walk, literally he becomes human by standing on two legs and defying his animalistic state, he finds his way into the town and encounters the town people, who first treat our hero as an object of curiosity. He's made to perform in a circus, until a professor rescues and assumes the care of this noble savage. The care is not for the body alone, but for the soul first and foremost, as Caspar is taught music, dance, grammar, and even formal logic. The cultivation of this noble savage is an act of his humanization through all-around or polymathic, all-around education, wherein Bildung, it's a German word that denotes formation, cultivation via education, aims to make him a whole, a human with capital H. This process of formation grows progressively until he's murdered suddenly and abruptly. I will not give you any more spoilers, unless in case you want to watch the film. But what interests me here in this film is that it encapsulates the contradictions of the Enlightenment. Its belief in cultivation and self-improvement via education on the one hand, and the romanticist conception of its futility in the face of contingency of life and death and of the forces of nature on the other hand. It is this dual character of the Enlightenment that I want to explore today through art, and specifically first through the advent of neoclassicism in opposition to Baroque in the mid-18th century, and then of Romanticism in opposition to neoclassicism in the second decade of the 19th century. On one side of the contradictions of the Enlightenment are reason, empirical observation, concrete experience, the belief in scientific rationality and progress, and on the other side, a romanticist insistence on feeling and affect, on poetic language, fascination with irrationality, forces of darkness, and the sublime. The sublime here is understood as an outcome of a conception of nature as an inconceivable, destructive, and chaotic force that overrides human will or our abilities, our capacities to represent this force. I don't consider this romanticist impulse as external to the Enlightenment, but as part and parcel of the contradictions. On one side, if I were to specify, we have Locke, Kant, the French encyclopedists such as Diderot and Leclerc, and on the other side we have Rousseau and the early German romantics such as Novalis and the Schlegel brothers. So let's start with the first pole, the pole of reason, human resolve, education, and cultivation. The Enlightenment propagated all-around education of mankind as a gateway to its full realization as humanity via equality and freedom. In the philosophical discourses of the Enlightenment, aesthetic experience occupied an especially important role. In his third critique, Critique of Judgment of 1790, Immanuel Kant puts forth aesthetic judgment or judgment of taste as one that is both, what he says, subjective and universal. I'll explain. Acting as a bridge between the realms of senses, the empirical senses, when we touch, we eat, we see immediately, and reason, rationality, Kant's judgment of taste is what he calls disinterested, because it is detached from the practical concerns of everyday life. These concerns belong to the faculty of desire. Kant says, as regard to the agreeable, everyone concedes that his judgment, which he bases on a private feeling and in which he declares that an object pleases him, is restricted merely to himself personally. Thus, he does not take it amiss if, when he says that Canary wine is agreeable, another corrects the expression and reminds him that he ought to say it is agreeable to me. What this means is that it's purely individual and subjective. You might like that wine, I might not like that wine. It has no grounding in any conception of universality or necessity. As opposed to this merely individual liking based on the faculty of desire, the judgment of taste, that is, when we say something is beautiful, is universal. Here Kant says, but when he puts a thing on a pedestal and calls it beautiful, he demands the same delight from others. He judges not merely for himself, but for all men, and then speaks of beauty as if it were a property of things. So when you declare an art object, for example, that it's beautiful, it's not simply about your liking, but you're expressing something that is subjective yet universal. So in the judgment of taste, as Kant tells us, the universality of delight is only represented subjectively. This means that with Kant we have an understanding of the sphere of aesthetics as devoid of everyday and practical concerns and of belonging to a realm independent of the empirically grounded sensuousness as well as of morality. Friedrich Schiller, in his 1794 work, it follows Kant's third critique 3 years later, titled On the Aesthetic Education of Mankind, takes up Kant's idea of the disinterestedness and universality of aesthetic judgment and endows it with a social function. For Kant, aesthetic judgment is autonomous from partial interest and individual desire. And for Schiller, paradoxically, this autonomy, this detachment, and this disinterestedness has a social function. How can this be so? Let me try to explain. Here what we have is a theory of aesthetics as an autonomous sphere whose functionlessness, it's autonomous, it has no function, it's not geared towards self-interest, profit calculation, but yet this functionlessness has a social function. Let me explain this paradox. For Schiller, it is through autonomy as that which saves aesthetics from succumbing to the dictates of instrumental reason, meaning reason and rationality are utilized for profit, for calculation, for progress. They are means to an end. Division of labor that enchains the human being to partial tasks, that art can contribute to the furtherance of humanity. So within the capitalist division of labor, if you're an engineer, you know your engineering very well, you're reduced to the partiality of performing the tasks that you know best. So for Schiller, art becomes this bridge that connects the ruptured, right, spheres of human activity, or the detached spheres of human activity. He does not have hope in the revolution as an engine for historical change, since lower classes for him are uneducated, and upper classes are corrupt and arrogant. Sounds familiar? The only way forward is through gradual formation and education. For Schiller, the advance of civilization has historically detached or severed the harmony and the harmony of the senses and reason. An ideal that he located in classical antiquity, that he imagined was this realm of harmonious coexistence of senses and reason, and chained the human to partiality of interest. In this context, it is art as an educational tool of enlightenment and the sphere of aesthetic experience that could undo this detachment and lift the human from partiality. As art theorist Peter Bürger tells us, it is within a society characterized by the division of labor, that art is, that art is to make possible the development of the totality of human potentialities that the individual cannot develop in his sphere of activity. End of quote. What we have here is a conception of art as an autonomous sphere of activity grounded in the autonomy of aesthetic judgment, conceived as universal, and the function of this universality in the bourgeois conditions of the division of labor and instrumentalization of science for progress is to put together the severed halves of humanity. Here we have an Enlightenment notion of Bildung, again, formation, cultivation, that is to overcome the other pole of the Enlightenment, the blind belief in progress carried through the scientific application of reason. So these two poles that Schiller brought together as a paradox, art's autonomy and the social function of this autonomy, were to reappear later on as mutually exclusive and antagonistic, especially in the 19th century debates on art for art's sake versus the conception of art as an instrument for social progress. Basically, those who believed in art for art's sake, they believed that art should not be instrumental for any social needs, for political purposes. Art is its own domain, and art is a free self-expression of the artist. And others who were arguing against this belief thought that art is an instrument for social and political change in the conditions of revolutionary turmoil that you had in 19th century France and Europe. Now let's talk about artworks, or arts themselves. The arts of the Enlightenment period emerged in the context of political debates, but also more importantly in the context of concrete historical transformations taking place in the 17th and 18th century. Art during the Enlightenment period both reflected and affected the historical transformations taking place in Europe via the development of the capitalist mode of production. We already had the Industrial Revolution in England in mid-18th and 19th centuries. The emergence of the bourgeoisie as a dominant economic class demanding its political and cultural representation that resulted in the French Revolution of 1789, and the extraction of resources from the colonies that generated unprecedented wealth in the metropolitan centers, amongst other factors. And battles were not only taking place on the fields and deserts, mountains and valleys, and of course in the world market of capitalist appropriation, but also in one of the first expressions of the bourgeois public sphere, in newspapers and art salons. It is not accidental, of course, that Kant's call for exercising reason, in the article, What is Enlightenment, that I assume you've already read, was published in a popular mass-produced form in a newspaper, Berlinische Monatsschrift, the Berlin Monthly. And Denis Diderot's reviews of the salons, which were art exhibitions at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Paris. These are first example of art criticism as a public journalistic exercise. Also appeared in an art periodical dedicated to art and literary reviews. Diderot himself, siding with the ideals of Enlightenment, materialism, liberation from religion, reason as an instrument for furtherance of humanity, supported the new tendencies in art and especially the neoclassicists, and offered a fierce critique of Baroque painters such as François Boucher. The Baroque style was dominant in music, fine arts, literature in Western Europe since the early 17th century. It is characterized by excessive floral and ornamental forms, as you can see here, softness of brushstrokes, saturation with color, recessing and atmospheric backgrounds. You always had clouds, fog formed with satin drapes, luscious vegetation, idyllic scenes, populated with naked Venuses and Cupids. Bareback odalisks, slaves basically, and other amorous creatures. By the 18th century, in the context of the Enlightenment political and philosophical ideals of equality and democracy, Baroque came to be seen as regressive, as the art form of absolute monarchy, as the image and representation of its power. So on the one hand, right, we have the Enlightenment belief in political emancipation, in virtue, in public virtue, and on the other hand, we have absolute monarchy that is still ruling. Here we are talking about the French context. In this art form, the decadent aristocracy found the semblance of its own indulgent salon culture in sensuous and lavish forms. As opposed to this, the neoclassicists sought their ideal of democratic equality and virtue in the ideals of classical antiquity. Not only in the model of the Greek polis, but also in the ideals of beauty and harmony that the Greco-Roman art of classical antiquity for them embodied. This was the second return to these ideals, the first being the Renaissance discovery of antiquity. This time around, however, the neoclassicists were not only returning to the Greeks, but also to the Renaissance masters such as Michelangelo, Titian, and Raphael. This new return was facilitated by ongoing archaeological excavations, the discoveries of Herculaneum and Pompeii, but also by the so-called grand tours of Italy by young men and women of European upper classes since the mid-17th century. We could say these were the first tourists, in a sense. As opposed to what was perceived as the lavish immorality of Baroque art, imitating the corruption of the court of Louis XV and Marie Antoinette, we all know that Louis XV famously said, "Let there be flood after me, I don't care. I will spend, I will party, I will indulge in decadence, the future is in the present." So as opposed to this, the neoclassicists selectively appropriated themes and subject matter from the lives of historical figures of the world of antiquity. As exemplum virtutis, examples of virtue, painting was conceived in terms of a moral tale wherein individual resolve and virtue win over corruption and decadent indulgence in sensuousness. One could claim that neoclassical art depicted the contradictions of its time, the new public consciousness arriving with the Enlightenment and rebelling against the ancien regime, the old regime of feudalism and monarchy. However, neoclassicism literally clothed these contemporary contradictions in Roman garments. I'll come back to this in a minute. It is enough to compare two works by Baroque artists, one work by Baroque artist François Boucher, and another one, neoclassicist Angelika Kaufmann, to be able to detect a shift from painting conceived as a sphere for a free play of colors, forms, and creatures harmoniously inhabiting a natural, architectural, decorative landscape, to the conception of painting as a narrative of resolve and moral virtue. Okay. My pointer is not working, but on the upper corner you have a painting by Boucher, and on the lower corner is a painting by Angelika Kaufmann. Boucher's work is an allegorical presentation of painting, wherein an adolescent woman, who herself serves as the allegory of painting, immersed in drapes and foam, and surrounded by the tools of her profession, is rendered in the act of painting. In this mythological setting, replete with lightness, weightlessness, the allegory of painting depicts another mythical theme. Surrounded by three rosy-cheeked cupids, she paints the one closest to her on a shield-like surface that resembles a mirror. I think I can make this work somehow, but... Okay, no. One moment. Okay, yes. So you can see the mirror shield that she's painting and the cupid that is closest to her. Okay, so the dramatic recession of dark clouds in the background alternates with the blue sky and is echoed in the lower right corner of the foreground that the girl shares with the cupid. Here. There is an coloristic echo of atmosphere here. She does not look at the cupid, but throws an absent gaze that brushes off the side of the cupid and casts a glance over a distant and indefinite horizon. The detachment from the action that she's performing endows the painting with a sense of facility, a sense of ease, as not only Boucher's painting, but also the painted allegory in the suspended act of painting are actually mirror reflections of a world that does not exist. So normally allegory represents something that does not exist. It's a concept, right? It represents a concept. As opposed to this, Kaufmann's painting presents the artist herself in action. As a rarely accomplished female artist who was a founding member of the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1768, a rare case of social mobility for a woman in the profession, Kaufmann presents herself in the moment of utter focus, seriousness, and concentration in the act of sketching a male sculptural torso. Here. And this is the model from which she's sketching, which is a fragment of a statue. She has transported herself to an ancient classical setting signified by two Doric columns. Here are the columns. And the fragment of the sculpture that appears on the base of another column. Yet the fragment of the sculpture already hints towards a sense of historicity, because the sculpture itself is only a fragment available to the 18th century artist as an archaeological artifact. It had to be discovered, historicized, and it's this consciousness that is reflected in the act of painting. Kaufmann's gaze directly pierces through the object she draws, wherein the hand, in a frozen moment of the intensity of the movement, completes the central representational pyramid that starts with her gaze. Here you can see it. Extends to the sculptural fragment, and it's actually more obvious here. And culminates in the gesture of the hand holding a pencil. So the concentration and the tensity of the composition takes place in its very center. For Kaufmann, the act of making art is an actual process of work or of engaging with the material world to render the ideal of beauty and virtue concrete. If Boucher's allegory of painting is an ahistorical, mythological space, Kaufmann's painterly act is situated in the intersection of the ideal of classical antiquity and its recuperation or revival in Kaufmann's own present as signifiers of freedom, subjective intentionality, and will. As opposed to the illusion of facility or ease in the painterly act, in Boucher's work, in Kaufmann's self-portrait, painting is a process of labor that involves self-instruction and intention. The characteristics of neoclassical art include the search for the ideal of beauty, of moral good and virtue in classical antiquity. Formally, the neoclassical painting, neoclassical painting creates a pyramid-like compositional order where the tense action takes place in the center, wherein the peripheries of the canvas provide an echo of this intensity. You can see it here. This is the center of the composition as a pyramid-like structure, like a triangle, and then the intensity of the action is echoed in a less intense manner in the peripheries of the canvas. Of course, there's also a masculine versus feminine dynamic that takes place here. Neoclassicism privileges line that stands for order and reason to color that signifies flamboyant and vivacious disorder. It creates a hierarchy of genres where historical painting stands at the peak, followed by portrait, landscape, still life. And arguably, it stages the contemporary contradictions as if these are historical events from Roman times. I'll explain this in a moment. So French neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David's work is especially paradigmatic in terms of understanding how neoclassicism renders the Enlightenment ideals of reason, political freedom, and moral virtue visible by borrowing from Greco-Roman subject matter. As a student and then teacher at the French Academy in Rome, he confronted the Baroque conventions, went on to side with the French Revolution later on by acting as the Jacobins' Minister of Propaganda. It was the first position created back then. Developed his own school of painting and was subsequently appointed as the first painter of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806-1815 after the Bonapartist coup. So one particular painting of 1784, before the French Revolution, crystallizes not only the above-mentioned features of neoclassical art, but also the political contradictions in pre-revolutionary France. These contradictions evolved around the outmoded survival of the Ancien Regime and the birth of antagonistic democratic forces and the advent of the bourgeoisie as a dominant class. In David's seminal painting, The Oath of Horatii, history appears on a theatrical stage. It's almost staged like in theater. He depicts the moment when the family of the Horatii from Rome is taking an oath in the struggle against the rival family, Coriati, from Alba Longa. The simplicity of the architectural setting, the colonnade that suggests recess but does not represent depth, here, heightens the drama of the action on the foreground, where in the central pyramidal composition, the three sons salute their father who holds their swords for them. The dramatic light, the sculpturalesque modeling of the leg and arm muscles of the men, you can see it here, they resemble an ancient sculptural relief from antique times, so there are visual references here as well. The fixated gazes of the sons on the father's face, intersecting with the swords, and this is one could say, the epicenter of the composition, when the gazes come together in the intensity between the swords and the hands. Contrasts with the periphery of women and children sunk in piety, in mourning, in a state of emotional distress. The patriotism of the Horatii of Rome and dedication to their father stands for a broader political message of sacrifice, heroism, and virtue for the republican values and social contract that David adhered to, and that were to sweep France through the Revolutionary Act 5 years later, in 1789. Here in David's painting, the gesture of allegiance, rendered in pantomimic perfection, like mimicry, right, expresses moral dedication. The technical minimalism, or the economy of means, of expression, right? It's not the lavish rendering of Baroque colors and so on, but it presents an economy of expression. In the Oath of Horatii, the effacing of brushstrokes and the austerity of the color scheme is quite uniform, one could say, are meant to highlight the subject matter. Art historian Thomas Crow argues that what was at stake in David's neoclassical paintings was the mobilization of another, oppositional public in the prevailing conditions of the absolutist monarchy. But this opposition could not yet be brought home in terms of representation. Rome here acts as a privileged symbol in the conflict of social values, turned over to the outsiders, and here stands for the republican values of sacrifice for a social ideal of peace and harmony. In short, David did not depict his contemporaries. He masked the existing contradictions by borrowing a tale, right, from Roman times. As Karl Marx says in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, written in the aftermath of the 1851 coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon, the revolution of 1789-1814 draped itself alternately in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. But unheroic though bourgeois society is, it nevertheless needed heroism, sacrifice, terror, civil war, and national wars to bring it into being. And in the austere classical traditions of the Roman Republic, the bourgeois gladiators found the ideals and the art forms, the self-deceptions that they needed to conceal from themselves the bourgeois limited content of their struggles and to keep their passion on the high plane of great historic tragedy. It's a very complex passage. I hope you can revisit later. What it signifies is that the bourgeois revolution ultimately is about securing the partial interests of one minority class, but yet it had to drape itself in grand tragedies, in heroic forms, to universalize its struggle. The political and ethical ideals of the Enlightenment were not only the only ones that artists strove to make visible and tangible. The fascination with scientific discoveries did not only become subject matter for painting, but also helped to transform the artistic means of production. For example, the invention of the perspectival space during the Renaissance, oil painting, and other experiments with materials and forms. 18th century English painter Joseph Wright of Derby represented the Industrial Revolution, and scientific revolution as well, sweeping over his country. the scientific discoveries associated with it, and the confrontation of reason and rationality with the so-called dark forces of unreason, such as alchemy, magic, and religion. What is notable is his application of light and shadow, a technique that Italians call the chiaroscuro, that he inherited from late 16th and early 17th century Italian Baroque master Michelangelo da Caravaggio, to scenes depicting industrial machinery, scientific devices, and experiments. In Joseph Wright of Derby's 1763-65 oil painting, a philosopher giving a lecture on the orrery. Orrery is a miniature model of the universe, which was a scientific device for studying the known universe at the time. The drama evolves around the scientific device. The intense light emanating from the device casts lights and shadows on the characters surrounding it, absorbed in attentive observation on the one hand and quasi-religious fascination on the other hand. Here, the light does not only act as a technical device to illuminate the faces of the listeners, this is kind of a painterly trick, the light comes from here and yet also illuminates the faces, for putting the attention on them as well, on the observers, but also acts as a metaphor for scientific knowledge. Wright appropriates the old religious iconography of light against darkness or good against evil and reapplies it to science. The light of God is replaced with the light of reason. It is the Enlightenment emphasis on empirical observation and concrete experience, the assumption that the world is available for knowledge through the sensuous perception of tangible forms that is captured in this painting. But, as I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, the Enlightenment has two faces. Vis-à-vis scientific thinking and empiricism, vis-à-vis the systematization of knowledge, we have the romantic rebellion that presupposes that the human faculties of cognition and representation do not suffice, are not enough to capture that which lies beyond our capacities to represent. And that which lies beyond our capacities of representation is what the Romantics called the sublime, wherein nature is conceived as a terrifying force. Developed by the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke in his A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, and re-elaborated by Kant, the sublime is defined in opposition to the beautiful. If the beautiful strives to capture order and harmony in nature, the sublime marks the impossible act of representing that which lies beyond human capacities of representation. The terrifying natural, spiritual, and artistic force that points at disorder and that cannot be imitated, cognized, represented, or systematized. However, that which cannot be represented can be experienced through the intensity of emotions. In painting, Romanticism that captures this interest in the sublime, in the impossibility of representation, emerged as a movement in 1830s in post-revolutionary France in a battle with the neoclassical order and its rationalism. However, it is born both as a reaction to neoclassicism and within it. A forerunner of Romanticism as a fine arts movement, Théodore Géricault, preserves the grandeur of neoclassical painting and its privileging of the historical genre, yet he renders history as a terrifying battleground between humans and nature that cannot succumb to human control. He preserves the muscular and sculpturalesque modulation of the body in neoclassicism, yet presents the body through its severed fragments. So with Romanticism and with Géricault, we have a fascination with the severed human body fragments. When Géricault came to the scene, David had established an entire school that rigidified into an academist imitation and repetition. And it is this academism that Géricault's 1819 painting, it's a monumental canvas, 5 or 6 meters. I should have put the dimensions here. The Raft of Medusa, presented in the 1819 Salon, challenged. Received with much controversy, from a retrospective glance, the painting launched the Romantic movement in France. However, the effects of this work were only realized a decade later, in a different political climate, in the aftermath of the 1830 revolution in the works of Eugène Delacroix. But let's start with the first things. First things first. Géricault's canvas presents a tragedy that was heavily mediatized through the developing media culture. A story was written over and over again and circulated in newspapers in France. An event that was also highly politicized and became an international embarrassment for the monarchy in France. Due to the political appointment of a young and inexperienced captain to lead the ship Medusa to the Senegalese port of Saint Louis, the ship drafted 100 kilometers from its course and ran aground near present-day Mauritius. Those passengers and crew members, about 146 men and 1 woman, who could not fit in the frigate's crowded boats, built a makeshift raft and sailed towards the African coast for survival. This is the content of the story. After running out of food and water, after 2 days, a true horror unfolds. A starved man start killing the wake, cannibalizing each other, and jumping off the raft in desperation and craze. Ultimately, only 15 men survived and made it to the rescue ship. After years of research, talking to the survivors, reading stories, and visiting morgues, Géricault's painting depicts the limits of the frontier of human experience in the face of the calamities of history and nature, but in a moment between total despair and the bleak hope. The grand painterly plane, before reserved for history painting, is, I'm sorry, my slides are showing something. Okay. Yes, okay, this is correct. So the grand painterly plane that was before occupied by neoclassical painting is here reserved for a contemporary tragedy and horror, wherein nature as a threatening force is conceived as that which drives human destiny. Géricault upholds the neoclassical compositionary order, the pyramid-like structure that I talked about earlier, yet makes it much more dynamic and full of pathos. So he basically puts the neoclassical pyramid into motion, into dynamic movement. The viewer's gaze is immediately fixated upon the lower right corner that nearly spills into the viewer's space with a centrifugal force here. It seems something is pushing these bodies towards us. The double man-sized bodily fragments and corpses take the viewer to the top of the first pyramid, here. After a momentary pause that rests the gaze on the figure of the man emphatically holding a corpse. Then, via a dynamic intersection of the gazes of the man holding the sail, the viewer reaches the apex, the peak, of the second pyramid. So 1 pyramid and then 2 pyramids, right? Towards which the various parts of the composition have been directing. The figure of the man with his back to the viewer and waving a handkerchief in the hope of being seen and rescued. The dramatic yet coloristically subdued landscape here in the background echoes this doom. This human drama of endurance and survival is no longer personified through individual resolve and through the figures of great leaders as in neoclassical painting. We can, actually I will pass, yes, but through anonymous and unarmed and unnamed survivors. But Géricault's canvas received its full realization in more than a decade later when Eugène Delacroix, who in the politicized atmosphere of the 1870 July Revolution, literally and metaphorically, turned Géricault's composition upside down. In the iconic painting, Liberty Leading the People of 1831, the barricade heaving up in the background is the raft turned 90 degrees. Here, you can see the comparison. So basically, he turns the compositional order here to 90 degrees. So now the corpses do not spill out into the viewer's space, but take the viewer into the picture, and the story of struggle of humans in nature and with each other is turned to a representation of a political struggle for liberty. Delacroix's allegorical rendition of liberty captures a moment of a rare alliance between various classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, in their struggle against the Bourbon monarchy. Yet this short-lived alliance gave away, and constitutional monarchy led by the Orleans dynasty was instituted. With the failure of the revolution of 1830, and terrified of the proletariat as an emerging organized force, the bourgeoisie betrayed republican values and sided with monarchy. Similar to Géricault, Delacroix's composition follows the conventions of the neoclassical history painting, yet creates a dynamic and politically charged representation of a struggle unfolding in the contemporaneous urban space, with the Notre Dame on the background coming into visibility through the mist and smoke. And this struggle is led by an allegory of liberty, who is depicted as an actual woman, a contemporaneous woman, rather than, let's say, a Roman goddess. Delacroix's allegory is not an aloof goddess draped in the attires of classical antiquity, but modeled after a fleshy peasant woman garbed in a contemporary simple dress. Delacroix's romanticism here grounds revolutionary struggle in the reality of his time. If Jacques-Louis David's The Oath of Horatii had delegated the contemporary political struggle to Roman characters, with Delacroix we have a romantic revolutionary realism that was to pave the way to the realism of Gustave Courbet and Jean-François Millet, who depicted the struggle of workers and of peasants in the 40s and 50s, on the one hand, and to the late romanticism of landscape painters such as Frederick Church. So you have basically in Delacroix kind of a merging of realism and romanticism, or a realism grounded in the romantic conception of struggle. If in the mid to late 90s, realists such as Courbet and Millet positioned themselves as politically committed artists whose task was to witness what painter Paul Signac called the great trial between labor and capital, the other side of romanticism, its occupation with color, with the visibility of brushstrokes, led to the Impressionists' occupation with pure opticality, wherein the concrete material world is fractured, fragmented by and dissolved, fragmented and is dissolved into the canvas as a space for infinite reflection. But at times in late 19th century, we still continue encountering powerful moments of convergence between romanticism and realism, between preoccupation with form and color and limits of representation, and the striving to render social reality visible and concrete in its dynamic unfolding. Here in Adolphe Menzel's painting, and I'm finishing, the two poles of Enlightenment converge in a contradictory tension. On the one hand, the belief in the concreteness of human historical experience and human capacity to intervene and change the world, and on the other hand, the very limits of the human capacities to cognize and represent this very world that is and is not his. Thank you. I'll leave you with this painting.